Okay. Start with some baby pictures. This is my son about a year ago, about 6 months old, and I'm showing this because I think from this it's clear that even at a very young age, we can make goal-directed actions towards objects. So you can see that Jonas here has a real purposeful plan here to pick up that spoon. He's picking it up, and then he gets it to his mouth. So sometimes it works well, and he gets the right end, and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm going to be talking about research today on adults, not on children, but it addresses this question of how we represent graspable objects and their associated actions. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about different classes of graspable objects, things that have meaning, such as tools, and other things that are graspable that don't necessarily have a functional identity. So what I'll try to suggest to you today is that both graspability and knowledge about objects influences representations for action. And my interest in graspable objects, and specifically in tools, comes from one view of visual processing that suggests two somewhat separable visual processing systems. One that mediates visually guided actions towards objects, and another that mediates more visual cognition, or what you know about objects. Now, there's been a lot of work on this idea of two visual systems. And these systems, or these processing streams, can be defined both functionally and anatomically. And so you can see from this drawing here is that there's one system that's thought to project from the primary visual cortex dorsally, ending at the posterior parietal regions. And this has been named several different ways. So traditionally it was named as aware system for its role in spatial processing. And more recently, it's been identified as a how system for its role in visual motor control, or visually guided actions. And this system then is proposed to be somewhat independent from the other system, which projects ventrally, ending at the inferior temporal cortex. And this ventral stream has been nicknamed the what system for its role in processes involving object discrimination, object recognition, and it's often thought of as a more cognitive or conscious perception system, in contrast to the visual motor system, which deals more with visually guided actions. Now, also what's influenced my thinking recently has been a proposal by Laurel Buxbaum of a third system called the use system. And we'll get back to this as I present some data which seems to support this idea of a use system as well. But thinking of maybe a second action system that more focuses on skilled object use and motor planning rather than this direct visual motor control. If we go back to this idea of the two visual systems, there's evidence from a number of different domains that support dissociable systems. One line of evidence comes from neuropsychology, which has shown double dissociations between two types of patients. One is a visual agnosia patient who has damage to this what system, so a lesion in the occipital temporal region, and has functional deficits in discriminating simple objects. So she couldn't tell the difference between two different rectangular shapes. But if you ask her to reach out and grasp that shape, she will form her grip size accurately to the dimensions of the object. So she shows intact visual motor control towards these just kind of neutral objects, even though she can't perceptually discriminate between the two objects. So there's some sort of perception going on there, but it's not a conscious perception or perception and awareness. We can compare that to patients with optic ataxia who typically have damage to this how stream, or regions of the posterior parietal cortex. And in optic ataxia, we see the opposite behavioral performance. So an optic ataxic patient may be able to discriminate easily between these two shapes, but then if you asked him to reach out and grasp the shape, he wouldn't reach or form his grasp accurately to the size of the object. But also in support of this dissociation, we can look towards neurologically intact individuals and a series of psychophysical studies that have been done using visual illusions. This is just one example. So if you look at this, this is the Titchener circles or Ebbinghaus circles illusion. What you may perceptually experience is that the inner circle on the right looks smaller than the inner circle on the left. And this is consistent with a perceptual matching measure. If you ask somebody to try to adjust the size of the circles, they would, or to match a circle to another circle, they would indicate that the one on the right looked smaller than the one on the left. However, if you present this as a three-dimensional stimulus and ask the person to reach out and grasp that inner disc, they'll actually form their grip size to the physical size of the circle rather than to their perceived size. Okay, so this again suggests a dissociation between more a perceptual awareness of the dimensions or the size of that object and visual motor control towards that object. So the illusion is not revealed in the action. Now, this research is somewhat controversial, and that's a reason why there have been many studies done with these visual illusions, but it suggests an interesting behavioral outcome that supports this idea of two visual systems. A lot of my work, however, has not only looked at when these systems work independently, but when this independence breaks down, which seems logical that this would happen a lot. So even though you can find distinctions or separability or modularity between these two systems, it's likely that they do influence each other in many circumstances. And so one of these circumstances could be when meaning is tied to action. So what I mean by that is if you look at this example of grasping a toothbrush, there are many effective ways to grasp a toothbrush. That could likely be performed by that visual motor system alone, by that how or dorsal stream. However, if you're then to pick up a toothbrush in its appropriate, functionally appropriate way, which is the bottom picture, picking it up by its handle, it's likely that this would involve information from this more cognitive system of what that object is to influence then how you would grasp it. So in some work that I did several years ago, we suggested that, or we hypothesized that a functionally appropriate grasp, so one that is appropriate to the function of that object, requires an interaction between semantic and visual motor systems. So in order to test this, we did a series of studies that involved, behavioral studies that involved dual task paradigm. And the main task that we were looking at involved how do people simply pick up objects. We presented, and these objects were all tools with handles, familiar tools with handles. So we presented these tools in front of an observer with the handles facing away in different orientations, so facing away from them. And we asked people first, in just a control condition, just reach out and pick up that object with your dominant hand and place it down next to you. So that's all the instructions that they got. And what we found is that people tend to spontaneously grasp objects by their handles in this single task. So even though they're not told pick this up to use it, a majority of the time they'll actually reach around, even in a more awkward position, to pick up that object by its handle to put it down. But we then, as I said, hypothesized that in order to do this, this involved both processing of what that object is, some semantic processing about what they know about that object, and the visual motor system that then eventually picks up the object. So to test this, we implemented two distractor tasks. One was a semantic distractor, which involved, we had several different variations of the semantic distractor, but in general it involved learning pairs of words, so a paired associates task, and then while the subject was grasping the object, they would hear a word, and they had to repeat the associated word. Okay, so this went on continuously as the objects were placed in front of them. And it was speeded. They're both going quickly right at the same time. The second distractor task was a spatial distractor, which was based on an old spatial imagery task where the subjects had to visualize a block letter, which was constantly named to them, and they had to then classify the corners of the letter, kind of trace around the letter in their minds, and classify whether the corner was on the top or bottom of the letter. Okay, so they're doing this pretty active visual imagery task at the same time that they're grasping these objects. Now, this is just a schematic depiction of what the results are, and so I'd be happy to give you some more details later. But the idea is this, that in the grasping task, when people were asked to perform the spatial distractor at the same time, they still grasped objects by their handles. So this didn't look much different from the control task, where they were not doing any other task. But when they performed the semantic distractor, their performance dropped. So then we saw very little of that grasping by the handle. People just grasped in any other location on the object. And this was assessed by coding videotapes of the grasping performance. But you might say that there are other explanations for this. Maybe the semantic distractor was just more difficult than the spatial distractor. It just took up more attention. Maybe it would interfere with any other task.
Do you want to address questions as we go, or quickly?
If they're clarification questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
Clarification questions. Mm-hmm. So what was the baseline performance relative to the spatial and semantic? So it was better or worse? But you said that they tended to grasp it in a manner appropriate for use.
That's right.
That was X% at the time.
That was about 75% of the time.
So did the spatial distractor augment that?
So the spatial distractor, they were still grasping at about a little less than that, about 70% of the time. And then the semantic, they were down to about 20% of the time. Okay, so we really saw a big difference. And that's why, yeah, it's a little confusing just showing good versus poor here. But that's the magnitude.
But the no distractor condition was not in between.
That's right. The no distractor was the best. Okay. Yeah. And so we wanted to introduce a second motor task that didn't involve, that we assumed didn't involve semantic processing, to see if, to address this concern of, well, maybe that semantic distractor would interfere with just any task more than the spatial distractor. So we used just a simple visual motor tracking task where the subject had to keep a crosshair positioned on a randomly moving dot on a computer screen. And we found the reverse effects. So here, now when the subject was performing the semantic distractor at the same time as the tracking, they showed still very good performance, so no different than the control tracking baseline. But when they did the spatial distractor, this very much interfered with the tracking task. So we were primarily interested in the grasping, but we wanted to introduce the second visual motor task that didn't involve semantic processing. Okay, so this then convinced us more that there seems to be some semantic processing involved in grasping tools by their handles in an appropriate way. So we concluded that there's a distinction between grasping an object in any way, which could be performed by the visual motor system alone, because these subjects still could grasp the objects. They weren't reaching in the wrong place, and they weren't dropping them, but they weren't grasping them appropriately by the handle. But grasping appropriately is then something different that requires this inputs from a more cognitive or knowledge-based system. So that was previous work. Then we're the approach I've been taking more recently has been using functional MRI to try to get at some related questions about the influence of functional identity of graspable objects on motor representations. So in the studies that I'm going to present next, there's two fMRI studies. Much of the emphasis is on imagined action. And I'll also get to this point back at the end of the talk. So even though this first behavioral study that I just presented was really grasping, the tasks that were performed in the MRI scanner were based on imagined grasping. So just to give you a little bit of background on this, there is a growing literature on the functional equivalence between real and imagined actions. So, so looking at a number of neuroimaging studies, there seems to be quite a bit of overlap in the neural activity found in motor imagery tasks and motor execution tasks. And this falls in regions, in motor regions of the cortex as well as in the cerebellum. So the premotor cortex, supplementary motor area, regions of the posterior parietal cortex, which are regions all that I'll talk about more. So then a related line of work has looked at the idea that tools seem to activate or potentiate action representations regardless of an intentional response. So an example of this comes from some neuroimaging work that has found that simply just viewing tools or tasks that involve naming tools or making decisions about tools has found to be associated with activation in particularly the ventral premotor cortex and regions of the posterior parietal cortex. So that's interesting to say that even when people aren't given an explicit instruction to act towards objects, act towards tools, these tools seem to be activating some sort of motor representation. So based on this, we were interested then in the question of why do tools evoke motor representations? And there are at least two possibilities, and these are definitely, are not necessarily exclusive of each other. The first could be knowledge of function. So most of these studies in the past have presented familiar tools that you may look at and instantly know what a hammer does, a screwdriver, things like that. So is it the knowledge of function that's associated with tools that leads to this motor activation? Or is it the visual structure of the tool that specifies graspability? So not only are these tools familiar in their functional identity, but they look graspable. So maybe it's graspable shapes which tend to then activate these motor regions. And this leads to this concept of affordances, where Gibson first defined affordances as these environmental properties that are relevant for an animal's goals. And these are properties of the object, so the structure of the object, that don't rely on what you know that object to be. They just rely on what the object looks like and what you intend to do. Okay, so if you go back to the example with the spoon can afford eating, and you might pick it up in a certain way if you're ready to eat. Or the spoon could afford teething, which you might pick up in a different way if you're ready to, if your goal is to teethe. So this affordance notion really kind of follows this idea of the visual structure. And so we're trying to tease out, is it necessary to have knowledge about function? Do these meaningful tools necessarily activate motor representations, or is it the structure itself? So in this study, we asked, do representations for action differ for meaningful versus neutral graspable objects? And to address this question, we created two classes of stimuli. These are 3D models of objects that were presented to the observers while they were in the scanner. One group was tools, which were all defined as familiar objects with handles. And the other category we called shapes, which were based on just these basic geons, which were appeared to be graspable as they're presented, as it's presented here, but didn't have a specific identifiable function. We presented these images to our observers in a simple block design with control blocks of just scrambled images of the tools or the shapes. And we had them do two different types of tasks in separate runs. The one was a viewing task, where they simply were told to attend to all the objects and attend to all the scrambled images, do nothing else, just watch them. And the second was an imagined grasping task. And here they were told to imagine reaching out and picking up that object, just those instructions, nothing more, nothing about use. But they were told not to really move. And we watched them to make sure that they really didn't move. This is just some details about the scanning procedure. We tested 12 people who were all right-handed on a 1.5 Tesla scanner. And we did standard pre-processing analysis and then looked at the data on an individual level, looking at contrasts between the tools and the scrambled images and the shapes and the scrambled images. And then we took those contrasts and put them in second level random effects group analyses in order to make some conclusions about the population. So now this is the first task, viewing graspable objects. Now remember, as I said earlier, these previous tool studies, viewing tool studies, typically find premotor and parietal activation when people are just presented with tools and asked to just look at them or make decisions about them, name them. And we were interested specifically, would we get that premotor and parietal activation for the graspable objects that were not tools, those shapes? And what you can see is we didn't. So in the tool, the upper level here, we replicated the previous tool results. So we found activation, and here this is representing the premotor cortex and the parietal cortex, as well as a very large cluster in occipital-temporal regions. But in the shapes, the only significant cluster of activation was here in an occipital region, which has been identified as this lateral occipital region associated with object recognition. So we answered our first question, finding that the premotor and parietal regions were not associated with graspable shapes, given that this task that the subjects had no explicit goal to act.
Did you have any independent measure of graspability of these objects?
No, like asking if they looked graspable or
how graspable, how easy would it be to pick this thing up?
We didn't. It's a good question, and I'll get to that, I think, with the second study that I present as well. So all we had were these pictures. We didn't have the actual objects that for people to interact with or to make decisions about. So the second task was imagine grasping. And now here you can see many more similarities between the tools and the shapes. We found activation for tools and shapes in both the premotor cortex. This here is the dorsal premotor cortex. We found ventral regions, but as I'll point out, they're actually different ventral regions. And then we found parietal activation in both tasks, but as you can see, it's a reduced amount in the shapes compared to the tools, and also a reduced amount of activation in this occipital temporal cluster here. Okay, so the imagine grasping task showed us similar activation regions anyway in these motor-related areas. So the dorsal and left ventral premotor cortex and supplementary motor area and the posterior parietal cortex, which again replicates other studies that have looked at motor imagery tasks and found these related regions. But there were differences, even in this grasping task, in the region and extent of these regions that I mentioned. So here is just a closer look at an actual brain with the clusters kind of compared. So the white color is tools, the gray is shapes. And what you can see is that in this posterior parietal region, here we have less activation in the shapes compared to the tools. Here's our big occipital temporal cluster, where in the tools, the activation extends down to the fusiform gyrus and up to the middle temporal region. Shapes is still just that object region. And then the ventral premotor cortex was actually different as well. So we found more inferior regions in the tools than the shapes. So preliminary conclusions based on this first study. Imagine grasping activates a network of frontal and parietal regions that are involved in real grasping, and that was the case for both tools and shapes. But we found differences between the tools and shapes for both the viewing task, which was the big difference where premotor and parietal were not even found in the shapes, and then in the grasping task we found those really differences in the extent, much greater extent in the tools with the tool stimuli versus the shapes.
Did you do a subtraction of the graspability of the tool minus shape?
We did, yeah. And so we found a similar pattern with that direct subtraction. But it was, since the controls, it's much higher level control then, it wasn't as clean, but it suggested the same pattern.
Was there anything that survived the tool that was present in shape minus tool?
Shape minus tool, no, there was not. Yeah.
So were all your tools simple, graspable, handled tools?
They were.
Okay.
They were all with clear handles. Many tools like carpentry tools, like a hammer, a screwdriver, and then other things like a razor and a hairbrush, things like that. So they all had clear handles.
Because I was worried otherwise that some of the greater activation was if you had to do weird hand configurations, like with the scissors,
Oh, right.
complex representation
Right.
of
Yeah.
tool interactions.
But no, they're all very simple handle tools. Okay. So this first experiment suggests that functional identity does contribute to representations for actions. We did see the differences, even though both types of objects could be thought of as graspable, we saw greater activation in these meaningful function objects. But there were a number of differences between the tools and shapes. So this may get back to your question as well, that those shapes, I mean, although they're three-dimensional, the different orientations, they appear graspable, people never had the experience of actually grasping them. Maybe, and they likely had motor experience with all of the tools because they were very familiar tools. So familiarity, again, the tools may be more familiar than the shapes. Visual complexity, those tools actually looked very different than the shapes as well. So a number of these factors could have explained some of those differences. So we did another study, which became a little bit more complicated because we introduced novel objects. Okay, so the purpose of the novel objects then was to try to equate these ideas of what the objects looked like, how familiar they were, and whether or not people had experience grasping them at all. So we created 16 wooden objects. These are a couple of examples. And then we scanned them with a scanner and scanned the texture and modeled them so that we could present models of these different objects visually in the scanner. So it's, again, just projected on a screen. So now we had the real wooden objects that they could interact with, and we had the visual objects that we could present to them quickly in the scanner. We've followed a similar paradigm except for a couple differences. One is that we now had some additional behavioral measures. So we looked at how people grasped these objects before and after they went in the scanner. Although in the scanner they're still doing imagined movement. And we introduced a third task, which was imagined using. So now, in addition to an imagined grasping task, people are asked to, in the imagined using task, imagine picking this up and using it. Okay, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how we taught people how to use these objects. Okay, so some more about the experimental design. We had 16 objects, as I said. We separated them into two groups. So there were 8 of them that had functions and 8 of them that didn't have functions. And we had 24 subjects, so half of those subjects learned how to use half of the objects that we'll refer to as tools, and the other half they got to manipulate, but they didn't learn their functions. And then the other half of the subjects, the other 12, learned functions for the other half of the objects. So we had to counterbalance the objects within the two subject groups. And I'll refer to these objects that we trained people on their functions as tools, and the other ones that don't have functions as shapes, even though they're all just novel shapes. Okay. Okay, so we had people go through 2 days of training on how to use or manipulate these objects. And it was pretty quick. The first day they would come in, and the experimenter would show the subject how to use the object in a specific way. So they might, take one of the objects, and the objects all had other small objects as goals. So you could take one object and push a ball with it on the table. So they were all some kind of real types of functions that would specify where you should grasp the object, but they were never explicitly told this is the handle. Okay, so they're just shown by the experimenter, this is what you do. The subject got to practice using that other object, and then they practice pantomiming using the tool, and they're given feedback on that first day. And then they get training with the shapes as well. So the other half of the objects, they get to manipulate. They see the experimenter manipulate them in just some arbitrary way, and then the subject gets to manipulate them as they want to, so maybe just turning it in their hands, picking it up, putting it down. And we tried to equate the amount of time that they would pick up and manipulate those shapes with the time that they spent learning the functions of the tools. Then they would come back in on the second day, and the subject would need to show how to use the tool correctly at least twice, just by pantomiming. And they also came in and manipulated each shape again for about the same amount of time. And then it was clear, they had to do that at least twice accurately. It was clear by the end of the second day that they could do this well. So they were pretty simple, and there weren't that many to learn. So we found that 2 days of training was enough. And then on the third day, they were scanned. But before scanning, the subjects were asked to just spontaneously grasp each tool, so the half of objects that they had learned as tools, similar to the study I presented earlier. So they're just the objects put out in front of them with the handle in different orientations and facing away from them. And then they were asked to just pick up the object and place it down, okay, with no other explicit instructions. Then, after that, they were asked to demonstrate the use of each tool so we could see if they still remembered the use. And then they were also asked to manipulate each shape because we wanted, right before they went into the scanner, we wanted them also to have the same amount of motor experience right that day. And then after the scan, we had the subjects come out and grasp and use each shape as well. So they did the same spontaneous grasping task. So we put the shape in front of them, and they had to pick it up and move it. And then we said, now pick up that object and come up with a use. Okay, and this was so we could get an idea of whether the grasp and use that they spontaneously might have been thinking about in the scanner was anything like what we had come up with for the actual function of the object, even though they weren't trained on the functions of the objects.
Sarah, I'm sorry if you said this already, but what did they learn when they learned to manipulate? Was it just palpation? I mean, what was it?
Well, what did we intend? Or
How did you show them? How did you demonstrate?
well, really, we would just take them. I'll show you my water bottle here. The experimenter would just take the object and do something like this. Just put it down and pick it up, and so. Yeah, they got to feel it, and I mean, it was mostly we intended for them to have some graspability experience now, so that they see these are really graspable objects, although they were real objects. So I don't know that necessarily would have made a difference. We didn't do a condition which I would like to do, but we haven't done it where they get to potentially see functions or just see the objects but not get the motor experience of using them. Okay, so it was pretty unstructured though, and then they were told they could do anything, but they were just, if they didn't pick it up and manipulate it for long enough, they were told to pick it up some more. Okay, so it's similar design as in the other study, a block design where we alternated blocks of tools, blocks of shapes, and scrambled images, which are just the scrambled images of those tools and shapes. And as I said, they did now 3 different runs. One was the viewing task, and we actually made it a little bit more focused this time, and we had them do this one back task where they were watching objects come by, and they had to decide if an object they saw was the same as the one that they had seen previously. So just because we wanted to introduce a little bit more attention in that task. And then we did imagine grasping, which was the same as in the other task. Just imagine picking up that object with your right hand, placing it down. And then imagine picking up that object and using it, and then placing it down.
And each object is shown, is it always shown in the same orientation when it's shown?
No, every time it was shown in a different orientation. So there were 4 different orientations, which turned out to be the handle facing kind of obliquely away or towards them. Okay, and similar processing as before. We also, based on the previous study, we wanted to look at some region of interest analyses. So specifically, we were looking at the ventral premotor cortex and the inferior parietal cortex, which show the big differences in that previous task. Okay, so now here are the results. First, I want to show you what people actually did behaviorally. So this is the real grasping part of it, which, remember, in the scanner, they're just doing imagined grasping and using. But we did another control on a group of different people with all of the objects, just to ensure that these objects didn't seem to suggest grasping. There wasn't a handle that we didn't intend, so that these objects were truly novel or neutral graspable objects without any functional training. So we had 12 people come in. These are different people than those who were scanned. They came in for 2 days just to manipulate the objects, just as the subjects did with those shapes. And then on the 3rd day, we asked them to spontaneously grasp those objects and to come up with a use. Okay, so these subjects got no functions for any of the objects, but we just wanted to see, well, what does the data look like if they just get to manipulate these objects for 2 days? And this is what it looks like. So here's the spontaneous grasping, where we just put the object out in front of the person and say, just pick it up and place it down. And they're grasping by the handle as we named the handle, but they didn't know about the handle, about 1/3 of the time, which makes sense because you might say there's 3 places to grasp this object on either end or in the middle. And then when we asked them to grasp and come up with a use, they did this as we had defined these objects later, about 15% of the time. So they really weren't, none of these objects suggested a specific use without the functional training. Okay, so this was just a separate behavioral experiment that was done as a control. Now here's back to the fMRI subjects. So now this is their performance grasping and using those objects that were trained as tools. Okay, so grasping spontaneous by the handle, they were now grasping at a little bit more than 60%, which I think is somewhat remarkable in that they only have these couple days of training with these novel objects, and now they actually are, a majority of the time, grasping the objects by what we had defined as the handles. But even more striking is showing that they really did now treat these objects as the tools that we taught them about, because when they were told, show us how to use these objects, they were close to 100%. Okay, so it showed our training on the tools did work, and these novel objects now became functionally identifiable objects. And then this is the same subjects now using the shapes. So we can see a difference here in that their spontaneous grasping by the handle is now around 40%, and grasping to use it is about 30%. Okay, so we see some behavioral differences. Now the question is this revealed in the imaging results? So first I want to show you the imagined grasping task. Okay, so remember there were 3 tasks. And I'm showing you this because this is the least striking differences. There actually were no statistical differences between the tools and the shapes. You can see the regions are almost exactly the same of the dorsal and ventral premotor cortex, and the region of the posterior parietal cortex, which is really the inferior parietal region, and then these more visual temporal lobe regions. And so we didn't find differences in grasping between tools and shapes. Now there are a few explanations for this. I think one of them is this idea that we didn't explicitly tell people to grasp the objects for use. Okay, so now the tools and the shapes look very similar to each other. So if they're just told to imagine grasping, then there isn't necessarily a suggestion to grasp it in a way that you would use it. We also, this is back to the behavioral data, what they really did. Now, of course, we can't say what they really did outside the scanner is what they were imagining in the scanner, because we don't have any way to say that that really is true. But it gives us some indication maybe of what they were imagining if we look at what they were really doing. And what this shows is that even though people were up to about over 60% of grasping by the handle, there's a large amount of variability across the subjects. And we had to exclude one subject. So we have 23 subjects here. A number of them did grasp the object by its handle all the time. Some were half the time, and a few were not very much at all. Okay, so because of this amount of variability in grasping by the handle in the behavioral task, this may have led to then, not enough power to detect that there were differences between the tools and shapes. But it's interesting to think about, even in this grasping task, which didn't specify use, that we don't really find a difference between the tools and shapes. Because we didn't find a difference in the clusters, we used that task, the grasping task, to define functional ROIs in these 2 regions that we were interested in. So we took the grasping clusters, the inferior parietal cortex, and in the ventral premotor cortex on the left side, and then used these regions to further analyze the viewing one-back task and the using task. Okay, so this is, again, the whole brain analysis. Now this is the one-back, the viewing task. What you can see here is there are differences between the tools compared to the scrambled images and the shapes, and they fall particularly in the ventral premotor cortex, which replicates basically what we found in the original tool shape study, where we see activation in the tools but little in the shapes. So again, this was just the viewing task. And looking further at the specific regions of interest, the left inferior parietal lobe and the left ventral premotor cortex, we found that there was a greater effect in the tools compared to the shapes for both regions. So this is now showing us there was greater, basically, intensity, signal intensity in those 2 regions for tools versus shapes in the viewing task. And finally, the last task was imagined using. And again, it kind of pops out that you see differences in the tools and the shapes. And those differences fall in the premotor cortex and in the parietal cortex on the left, but also on the right. Now we have activation in the right ventral premotor cortex, which we don't have in the shapes. Okay, so, and this is pretty striking also. You can notice that we see that's different in the extent of the ventral premotor cortex as it extends all the way down to the inferior frontal gyrus in the tools and not in the shapes. Okay, and then our region of interest analyses, confirmed this and that there was more activation in the left inferior parietal region for tools and shapes, and in the premotor region it was marginally significant. I think one explanation for that is that our region of interest actually didn't include that lower region of the ventral premotor cortex that extended all the way down. So the region that it did include wasn't quite different. Okay, so we then could conclude from this novel object study that when novel graspable objects are given a function, both the cognitive or the behavioral and neural representations are similar to those associated with tools. So the objects that were now defined as functions were grasped and used as tools, the behavioral data showed us. And then we found activation in these regions that were associated with imagined using, grasping and using of tools that we've seen earlier. Now for the objects without a function, there were some interesting results. So for the grasping task, those objects that did not have a function looked similar to the function-specific objects. And one explanation for this may be that the use was not specified in that imagined task. But in the viewing task and in the using task, we saw reduced activation in the inferior parietal lobe and in the premotor cortex in the non-function objects compared to those function objects. And notably, we saw the ventral premotor cortex extended more inferior regions when the objects had a function versus when they didn't. So we suggest then that knowledge and or experience with function increases activation in the inferior frontal cortex and the left inferior parietal cortex. And then this brings up the question, is this evidence for a use system? As I introduced earlier, Laurel has proposed this two action systems, this use system that may be then separate from a grasp system. And I think this does support it in that we find that when objects are associated with a use, we see greater activation in this inferior parietal region. Okay, and the other region that we do see is this ventral premotor cortex, which may fit into that model as well. So these imaging studies open a number of questions, but I wanted to just introduce two related ones that then are most relevant to the work that I've been doing here, and I'll be doing here in collaboration with Laurel over the next couple of weeks. The question, can we generalize from imagery or planning actions to overt action? So we're finding these results based on imagined movement tasks, but can we say that that really is the same as overtly grasping or using these objects? And related to that are these and other current neuroimaging findings on tool grasping and using consistent with behavior and the anatomical lesions seen in representational ideomotor apraxia. So apraxia is interesting to think about because apraxia in general is defined as this deficit in skilled actions. And Laurel has done a lot of work looking at this and at praxic patients and finding that this use inferior parietal system is associated with these their specific types of deficits. So we're doing an ongoing study right now that's looking at planning of tool grasping and using types of movements in apraxia and other controls. And this part of this work or the ideas are based on a study that Laurel did recently showing that planning of how to grasp neutral objects is impaired in this representational apraxia. So, and this is assessed by how similar decisions about grasping are to really grasping. So a congruence between a motor imagery task, if you were to imagine grasping in a certain way, versus how do you really grasp. And so we're then extending that to look at planning towards tools. And how does this planning or this imagery towards tools relate to the use knowledge deficit that's seen in apraxia? So what we're doing is comparing imagined and real actions by presenting real tools with handles. And again, these are all tools that have specific explicit handles and they're familiar. And we do have a control condition of some neutral objects as well. But we're asking people to do two types of tasks. To grasp the tools, to move them, just move them out of the way, and to grasp the tools, to use them. And these tools are presented in different orientations. And we're looking at their actual grasp performance, so where do they grasp the object, and also comparing that to decisions about where they would grasp the object if they were to move it or to use it. Okay, so we present real objects with little stickers on either end of the object, and in the imagined case, we ask our subjects to indicate would they grasp the object by the red area or by the blue area. And in the real grasping, they actually grasp by the red or blue. So we're assessing the congruency between planning a decision about where to grasp the object and where they actually grasp the object in an overt task. And we're predicting to see group effects so that the apraxic patients will show less congruence between real and imagined actions compared to control groups. And then, since these patients tend to, we think, show both a planning deficit and a use knowledge deficit, then if both of these contribute to their performance, then the patients should show the least congruence in their tool use task, which involves planning an action and the use task that involves knowing how to use that object. So I'll leave that there. We're just collecting some data now, so we'll hopefully have an update maybe the next time that I am here. And I'll just end with some acknowledgments to my collaborators at the University of Utah, Jim Lee, who's a physicist in radiology, and a number of graduate and undergraduate students.